Good evening. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the New York Public Library, for those of you joining us here in the Burger Forum and those of you who are joining us online. I'm Martha Hodes. I'm serving as interim director of the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers. Just before we get started, please do be aware that this event is being recorded. For those of you here with us in the Burger Forum, we do encourage you to wear a mask during the program. If you would like one and don't have one, please feel free to signal. We have some to give away. For virtual attenders, real-time captions are available by clicking on the closed caption button. Or if you would like a live transcript, please use the stream text link shared in the reminder email and chat. Okay, well, this evening we continue our terrific fall lineup of conversations from the Cullman Center, presenting in tandem with the Library for the Performing Arts, Cullman Fellow Jennifer Homans, speaking about her new book, Mr. B, George Balanchine's 20th Century, with New Yorker writer Claudia Roth Pierpont. Please allow me just a moment to say a word about the Cullman Center. We select 15 fellows each year who come to the library to gain intensive access to our unparalleled collections in order to write the books of tomorrow. Our fellows are among the best and most promising academics and independent scholars, fiction writers and poets, journalists, translators, playwrights, and artists at work today. Writers and scholars from any country are welcome to apply, and applications for the next cycle will be available on our website in June. Our next conversation from the Cullman Center takes place on November 15th, featuring New Yorker writer Hua Su, who will be speaking about his new memoir, Stay True. You can register for that event or any of the other terrific events at the library at nypl.org/events. You can also see everything the library has to offer by signing up for our newsletter at nypl.org/connect. All programs are made possible by the generous donations of patrons like you, so please do consider supporting the library in whatever way you can. If you have an NYPL library card, or if you live in New York State and would like to apply for one, you can borrow tonight's book for free, or you can buy the book from the library shop, and proceeds do benefit the library. You can find links to buy the book on the event page, nypl.org/conversations. Best of all, you can buy the book and have it signed by Jennifer Homans this evening, right outside the door after our program. Now, to tonight's program. Our guests will converse for 35 or 40 minutes, then take your questions. For those of you here with us, please use the cards and pencils that you found on the chairs. You can write your questions on those cards, and program staff will then collect the cards shortly before Q&A. If you're joining us online, please share your questions in the chat or by emailing cullmancenter@nypl.org, and those questions will be transcribed onto cards and also brought to our speakers. And now to our distinguished speakers. Jennifer's interlocutor this evening is Claudia Roth Pierpont, longtime staff writer for The New Yorker. Her recent essays include Race, War, and Winslow Homer, and How New York's Post-War Female Painters Battled for Recognition. Claudia is the author most recently of American Rhapsody, Writers, Musicians, Movie Stars, and One Great Building. And before that, Roth Unbound, A Writer and His Books, and Passionate Minds, Women Rewriting the World. She's the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, and best of all, Claudia was a Cullman Center Fellow in 2000-2001. Claudia speaks tonight with Jennifer Homans, dance critic for The New Yorker. A former professional dancer, Jennifer is the founder and director of the Center for Ballet and the Arts at New York University and a distinguished scholar in residence at NYU. Her previous book, Apollo's Angels, A History of Ballet, was named one of the 10 best books of the year by the New York Times. She's also the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, and she was a Cullman Center Fellow in 2016-17. Tonight's book, Mr. B, George Balanchine's 20th Century, takes up the life of the 20th century cultural titan and perhaps the greatest choreographer of all time. Publishers Weekly called the book an entrancing biography. Granta called it an epic portrait, a magisterial cultural history, and the New York Times called it a sensitive, stately, and often thrilling new biography. Please join me in a very warm welcome for Claudia Roth Pierpont and Jennifer Homans.
Thank you. I have so much to ask Jennifer and so little time, so plunging right in. I'd like to lead actually into my first question with a brief tribute to Jennifer's book and what seems to me to be its largest overarching achievement, and that is the balance she maintains between Balanchine as a man and as an artist. The live wire of connection that she continually runs between them, between the day-to-day life that is a biographer's duty to tell us about, and the artistic and spiritual life, which fill the ballets that we know and that make us want to know about the daily life in the first place. To those people who don't read many artist biographies, this may sound like an absolute given, like it's just part of the job. Of course she did that. But that ain't so. It's a very difficult feat to bring off, especially when it comes to artists who have lived recently enough to have acquired a very long paper trail or people trail. How many interviews did you do, Jennifer?
Over 200.
Over 200. Yeah. Which exposes basically not only a high amount of mundane detail, it can be sometimes seem in other bios like an avalanche of mundane detail, but often in our day gives us a lot to pass judgment on in the exposure of private behavior, and particularly these days of sexual behavior. Sometimes it seems to me that the bigger the bio, the smaller the subject becomes. In anticipating a bio of George Balanchine with his 5 wives and his famous pursuit of young women with their ages unchanging even as he aged, I wondered and maybe even worried a bit about just how this would be presented. And with this book, it has been presented in a way that seems to me a general triumph and is central to the book's achievement, since a lot of the balance has to do with precisely the way you must deal with the wives and the not quite wives and all the women who he loved but who also inspired him, because this is the link between the art and the life. I have my own thoughts about how Jennifer accomplished this magnificent feat, but I would like to start off by asking her how much this was in your mind. How much of a minefield did you feel you were entering in our day and age with this kind of subject?
I mean, I did feel it, of course, and I was aware, as you said, of all of the things that are well known about Balanchine. I guess my approach to it in terms of the women, because there are sort of two things here which you're linking that I agree with you. There's a very strong link between the balance of the life and the art and the women as a sort of, it's just the crucial piece that brings them together. Mm-hmm. But just to address the women first, I mean, I talked to lots and lots of dancers, and many of them more than once. I was extremely interested in their whole lives, not just their Balanchine stories. So I spent a lot of time with them trying to get to know them, because I felt that he really knew them. And they said that over and over again. He really knew them better than they knew themselves. This was a kind of chorus of... So I spent this time with them, and I tried to, when I did the writing, there was this question, well, you're going to name everybody? Is it all going to be, is it going to be like... Started to feel like, oh, my, well, we're going to have a little tell-all here. And that wasn't really the point, as Claudia said. It was really, the idea was that there are themes here that come out, and these are testimonies of women. That's how I treated it. Like, this is what they said, and we need to listen to what they said. So I tried to really sort of pull back a bit, and my job, as I saw it, was to say what they said and to bring it into a sort of context of the dances themselves, not necessarily even into a moral context, but into a context of what did it mean for them in their words, and then what did it mean for him insofar as we know that from his words and his dances.
What I found that you did that impressed me was I felt you avoided nothing, you apologized for nothing, you laid things out. I thought I knew the whole story, and there were things that surprised me, things about, for example, Holly Howard, his first New York girlfriend, and the question of rumors of multiple abortions when she's basically a teenager. All these kind of things you laid out, and your language is tough and straightforward, and I feel she's not hiding a thing, she's not saving him. But then you provide context. You provide psychology, not only for Balanchine, but for the women, as you say. You honor their decisions, their independence. Mm-hmm. And I think you come out of it respecting the humanity and the dignity of all these people. And given the fact you do these two things, it's a tremendous kind of balancing act. Each time you seem like a lawyer weighing, well, this happened, but let's see what and why and who. And there's a tremendous amount of compassion, I think, in the book for everybody involved. Yeah. And there were things I never realized about. I mean, he comes off seeming so alone through all of these tremendous love affairs, and he comes off the opposite of reduced. Not that he comes off greater, his genius is intact, but he comes off simply as a deeply complicated human being.
Which is what he was.
Right.
And, I mean, it's sort of the human animal on display, this account of what they made together. Because the thing about the women also is that the connection between the making the art, it's not just that they're women and he's drawn to them, it's that they're dancers. And he's going to make them, and they're going to make themselves. And he's going to make them, and they're going to make him make them. It's very complicated, and this whole idea of sculpting a body seemed to me to be really sort of revelatory. And he talks about it. You know, they're the clay. We're going to do it, but they do it together. He can't do it without them. Exactly. Obviously, yeah. Right? He can't. He's completely dependent on them, and they are not just a body. They are a person, a complex psychology, a heart, a soul, faults, difficulties, joy, aspiration, ambition, intense ambition. You know, these women, so many of them said to me, "Do you know what it feels like to dance one of these dances? That's what I want." Mm-hmm. I want, because it feels so good. It's just an entrancing and transformative experience. I mean, we're really talking here about metamorphosis in the classical sense, right? These are women who are making their bodies into something else, and they're all making a dance that's made out of those bodies. But it only exists in real time. It's not something you can then put on a pedestal and say, okay, here's the beautiful thing we made. No, it's like here and gone, tonight and not tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So as you know, I mean, these are very complicated artistic tools. If you think of them as paints and colors, they're just moving all the time.
They don't always cooperate, which paints
and they
colors
don't always cooperate.
Right.
And he doesn't always cooperate.
Right.
And so it becomes a very complex relationship.
You talk about the process, and artistic process is a very hard thing to talk about, and with Balanchine it's particularly elusive. It sometimes seems he walked into a room, he says he didn't have an idea until he saw his dancers. He walked out an hour later and there was this creature, this ballet that just came into being in the room. You actually do, I think, rather more than anybody I've read so far to illuminate the process. You can't pierce the mystery. None of us expect to be able to do that. But I'd like to ask you to talk about three things, one at a time, that you bring up along the way. One is the scores, and we know how musical he was, and we know that he read scores, and we know he was a musician and studied in St. Petersburg. But you provide a little more. You give us a sort of a conscious aspect of the way he prepared to go into the room by the way he prepared the study of the score. I'll give you a quote of yourself to set you up. He read scores the way most people read a novel before they go to sleep. And the fact that, oh, sorry, I don't
Go
know.
ahead.
You go.
No, well, that quote, just because that actually comes from a photo.
Uh-huh.
I mean, there's a photo of him sitting in bed with a score. And he's really, it was a language that he spoke so fluently that he was real. That's what interested him, I think. Well, many things interested him, but the whole idea of the preparation and the execution with the dancers, so that there's this preparation that's happening because he's so musically adept. And he spent a lot of time, like sometimes years, working on a score before he would walk into that room.
That's
with
what
the
I
dancers.
found
I mean,
so interesting.
Years.
He wasn't empty-handed.
He was not
something
empty-handed.
very much
He was not
prepared.
empty-minded. And he would copy the score out, do piano transcriptions, and so that he was, it's like, I don't know how many of you, you copy your notes and then you copy them again, and you know them more and more as you copy. And I think he was so deeply engrossed, and there was an analytic process. And here comes even to me, the more interesting part, which is that he kept that analytic process away from them. So that moment in the room, they didn't know necessarily that he had done all of that in the hours at home before, in those, at the table, the long hours just copying or transcribing or transposing music. He would just walk in the room, and he knew all the parts. He knew them, he knew the score, he knew what he imagined, the lights, the person who was going to be doing the costumes, and even a leotard and tights is a costume after all. So, there's a way in which he kept the whole thing in his head,
Right.
and each part had their parts and knew what to do, and then he's, as he said, assembling it all.
Right.
And the result, which is, I think, that I really learned this from other scholars and who worked on the music, including Kara Lee, I'm forgetting her name, Kara U. Lehman. She has written a beautiful work about the way in which what comes then is not just people dancing to music, or not just, right, but not people dancing to music. It's actually a whole different score. There's like a physical score and a musical score, and then they're put together. And there's an intertwining, and there's references within the dance score to different parts of the musical score. So a certain part might be referencing an early musical conceit, and then it's coming back later, so that we, the audience, suddenly are thrown off or feel illuminated, or there's an effect to that. So I think he was in control of all of that.
Yeah, you say at some point the score sat like a diagram in his mind's eye, and that's what I'm trying to get at, that there was something very solid going on when he walked into the room.
And he had conversations with these pianists that he was working
Right.
with, were also extremely accomplished musicians, and he
Right.
worked very closely with them as he was working with it. Is like a triangle, between him and the piano and the dancers and the soul.
You have a really interesting quote I hadn't heard before, with him saying, "I don't listen to the score, I read it." And of course, anybody who loves these ballets, all your light bulbs go off, because, oh my God, he did see music. That is what he was
Exactly.
talking about.
Exactly.
It's literally true.
Yeah.
He was proud of reading the score. He didn't
Reading
need to
the
listen.
score. He didn't
Yeah.
necessarily
Like a
go
novel,
home and
as
turn
you
on
say.
the record player, as it was then.
All right, next thing. I want to keep us moving because there's
Okay.
so much. There is a notebook, and you illustrate at least one drawing from it. It's from 1928. It has sketches of the first scene of Apollo. I'll read you really quickly to her description of one of these. He drew a commanding woman, legs split wide and crotch open to the audience, seated high on a platform. She towers over the small, crouched figure of the unborn god below. And then another one, which you don't illustrate, but in another sketch, the woman is a cross-legged Buddha-like deity, and this time she is sitting on the erect leg of a man standing on his head as his leg pierces her vagina. Around them all, we see temple worshippers, some prostrate in prayer. this is seems like an astounding group of drawings. I, of course, looked up your footnote in the back, and it said, collection of the author. So I would like to know, how did you come by this artifact? How many drawings are there? How long did he keep such a notebook? And what do they mean?
So, these notebooks came from one of my sources, and
Oh, that's so mysterious.
I'm not at liberty to say, as they say right now. It doesn't really matter, but they came from somebody that he knew well, and he they're not dated, but you can tell it's Apollo. I mean, you look at this drawing and you're like, it's
obviously.
Apollo, right?
Yeah.
It's Apollo, for
Oh,
sure.
there's no other way to tell that it's 1928?
There's some other dating in the book, but it's not on that page. It could have been. Pages are very
how big
loose.
Is this book?
There aren't very many. There's like that and the other one I described, and then there's some other loose images. Just like he made a lot of sketches, and
All
even
related to Apollo or other things?
No, other things. And many of those sketches are actually at Harvard. There's in his archive. There are other sketches of his doodles. He really was a good artist. He could draw. He could really draw.
And the point I'm trying to get at that you make is that, so here's another tool. Here's another bit of real consciousness. We tend to think of him as, I don't know, Martha Graham's famous quote, he was a prism that refracted music into dance, as though he were just this, as though he were a mineral, and
Exactly.
But there is consciousness.
Exactly.
Here.
There's this whole process which is visual, and he describes it, and I try to use his own words to talk about what he does, and he says this is not a direct quote because I don't have it in front of me, but it's basically, there's a feeling inside me and I know it's right when I get to that moment, and which is something that I think most artists would recognize. And the other phrase I loved that he would say, it's what I like. It's what I like. So he would sort of arrive at something that pleased him, that seemed right.
I have a few little fast questions tucked
Okay.
in here, and since we're on Apollo, I'm going to jump away from a minute from process just to ask you an Apollo question, because I wasn't sure what you meant by this, and it's very interesting. You're talking much later on about the 1970s when he's cutting Apollo, and you say, quoting you, he no longer needed or liked the mimed birth and death scenes, which looked old and dated. And then again you say he had left out the birth cycle, no birth, no death. So I'm asking you, do you think the end of Apollo is a death scene? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I've had this conversation with other people before. I think that there is a way in which the final images are a kind of ascent, which implies
Ascent?
ascent, which implies a leaving. It doesn't necessarily, I suppose, imply a death, but I do think there's those final notes in Stravinsky's score, which he talks about specifically as something tragic happening.
Yeah.
And you can hear it. It goes, you can hear it very well. So there's some event occurring. But I felt really that the and this is interpretation, of course, right? But there's clearly a birth in the old version, right? And that's gone. And the end of the other is also abstracted. So I think this what he was doing really was pulling it into an abstraction. What had been a narrative was being reworked into an abstraction.
Absolutely. I just was wondering about the death, because I'm very fond of Robert Garris. I don't know if you all know that book. I think it's called Following Balanchine, and he was following Balanchine from the 40s, I think, and he speaks about that last scene in a way that hits me as true to what I feel when I used to see it, as the gods are leaving us here alone on earth. They are going where they belong, and here we are left behind, and you have this desire, he said, to cry out, don't go. I can't do this without you. Where are you going, Apollo, Muses?
Right.
Where are you
going?
So I mean, I see that as tragic for us.
You mean the separation?
We're left behind godless in a way. Here we are. I mean, here we are, and they're
Well, isn't
ascending.
that a kind of death? I mean, that's a kind of
Well,
death. I think there's a way in which the themes in his life that speak to this are so, I guess that comes to another thing that
it's all
is-
open to
is
what you
in
see.
another of the themes that I put into the book because I felt like it was there,
Mm-hmm.
which is that there really is a strong theme of death, and it's a big, big.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of dead bodies in his ballets, as Barbara Horgan said, to me, and I was like, oh yeah, you're right, there are. Oh my, well,
Right.
and you start to interrogate that, and you look at the life, and you notice that here's the man who lived at a very young age through a very, very violent event, and whose life was at 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, torn apart by war and revolution, who experienced hunger and disease and, boils growing on his skin, and saw, the bodies dismembered in the street, and all of these kind of horrific things that he experienced, and the illnesses that were with him all of his life. Periodic, TB kept coming back for a long time. He was not so well, and he died of this strange mad cow disease before it was even discovered. He had these sort of physical ailments, even though he was incredibly robust as well. He had enormous stamina, but he was basically without one lung because of
Right.
the TB.
They thought he would only live, 2 years, 4 years?
Yeah, there were various. He said, I should have died several times. And he wasn't wrong. He wasn't a strong constitution. He should have died during the revolution. He should have died on a mountaintop from TB. Lots of other people did. Most other people who had it did. And, and then there were other times when he was really not well. So this theme of death, I think, and of the constant presence of death became for me a real sort of motif, because what I began to realize is that his greatest creative moments came from out of moments of great loss. They weren't out of moments of sort of joyous inspiration or something transcendental. They were out of it's all in ruins before us. Even you think of Agon, right? His then wife, Tanaquil Leclerc, had just been stricken with polio and robbed of her body in the dance sense of the word anyway, crippled, and he spent almost a year caring for her, and then he comes back, and from this moment, and it comes this incredible dance, and that's part back to your other question of how do you link the life how do you balance the life and the art without reducing one to the other, because it's always the fragile line. And so this was one other theme that I certainly saw and began to, I think, understand that he was able to use that loss as a form of creativity. Maybe because it was such an early, he had a lot of practice at that, at returning and remaking a whole world out of a ruin.
Yeah, I'm going to get to a question about his childhood, which you beautifully describe in a minute. I just have one more of these process, little bits of evidence you've brought out, and it was one that really floored me. I confess you have to be a real kind of ballet nerd or Balanchine nerd to say that.
I know
one of
what
the
you're
most
gonna
thrilling
say.
things in the book is to find Balanchine is reading Spinoza and taking notes on Goethe and Spinoza, and he's looking for something in these texts. He's looking for something and he has written notes, which Jennifer has found. They were for an article, and he was publishing in 1945, and the article was actually rewritten by somebody in a nice voice, but she's found the original notes. So tell us why he's reading these things.
So this was for me also, this was like a great moment.
Right.
Like, wow, okay, here we are. Suddenly I've got these they're basically fragments. And they were, I imagine, kept by the person, Donald Wyndham, who was rewriting the article. And they were put in a folder, and they're in the archive. And some of them are in his hand, and some of them are typed, and some of them are written in another hand that we don't know exactly whose it is. But the ones that are written in his hand make clear references to phrases by Spinoza, and it led me directly into, I mean, I'm not a trained philosopher, but I spent like 3 or 4 months reading Spinoza and talking to Spinoza experts and sort of trying to figure out what was he looking for in this. Because he, you know, as Lincoln Kirstein put it, he was an amateur theologian. He had a kind of deep interest in mysticism, in his own, he was an Orthodox Christian by, you know, Eastern Orthodox by birth and by upbringing. But he fished, and he was like so many artists. He just absorbed anything that came his way, and he was a deep reader. Lincoln Kirstein walks in one day and says, well, he's got all of Goethe in front of him, and he's reading his way through it all. So, you know, we have it from various different sources that he's reading these things. And the Spinoza thing is especially interesting because I think what was going on, and this is during the war, right?
Right.
In the war years, he's thinking, you know, like, and there's an interview that he does with an Orthodox journal where he starts talking about this as well, you know, sort of, he's defending dance. He's saying, you know, dancing is not sinful because in the Orthodox Church, some people think that it's a sinful activity because it's an exposure of the body, et cetera, et cetera. But he's trying to find a way, and the idea that God is in nature,
And therefore in the body, right?
And therefore the body has something divine in it. It's not.
It's kind of his own redemption as a man who lived for dance that he's finding, right?
Exactly,
the
he's
body,
finding
that
it is a spiritual practice. That it's not a you know, a sort of quasi-prostitution.
Which the church might have suggested it was.
Exactly, and which has been suggested over many ages.
Wasn't there some trouble with his burial in the Russian Orthodox Cathedral on these very grounds?
There was, on these very grounds, you know, that he made dances that exposed the human body more than had been exposed before, and therefore he, not to mention the fact that he'd been married 5 times, and they weren't really, these weren't proper Orthodox weddings, and you know, so there was a lot of discussion about whether he should be allowed to be buried in the Orthodox Church on 93rd Street. They did allow it, but I think in his own, he was deeply religious, but in a kind of like take what I can way, you know, taking what, and he was a follower of Uspensky for a while. He was.
So what he's looking for is a kind of redemption of the body, that there isn't a hierarchy where the spirit is above and the body serves, but these are the same.
Exactly.
These are the same. And since I took notes on your book, I can give you the quote you were reaching for when he was interviewed by this Orthodox journal, which was questioning, as Jennifer puts it, his allegiance to such a sinful art. And what he has to say is, we do not sin by dancing. We use our bodies like flowers in the field, which are growing and beautiful. The body can and should do the same thing. But again, this is getting back to this question of how conscious this man, who just seemed to be nothing but natural processes, was.
And who developed that myth about himself as well.
Do you think that was conscious when you say that?
I think he was very suspicious of words, and he was very good with words. I mean, you know, you think, well, he didn't give that many interviews. No, he gave a lot of interviews, and he spoke beautifully, even though in this very eccentric kind of, you know, he was in the United States for a very long time, and he was a good linguist, but his English was strange, and it kind of, I'm not sure I ever really sort of figured it out, but it's like more expressive than you or I could be. I mean, it's just, he has a way of talking about things that's quite extraordinary. So I think you're right. He's trying to come to some, and the notes, the Spinoza notes, then go on to be talking about lots of other things that are really interesting, like that he's looking around, that he can see things that other people aren't seeing. Why don't people see these things? Why don't they look at the top of buildings, he says? Why don't they notice these things? Well, he's looking. I mean, I kind of came up with this idea that that he's a watcher, that he's really a watcher. He's kind of always, he's seeing more than most people see. And I think he believed that he saw more than most people see.
For sure.
Yeah.
I wanted to get to your visit to Georgia, but I have a long quote from you, and I'm worried about the time. I'm just going to skip ahead to one question. I'm going to start skipping around to ask you as many things as I can fast. I'd like to throw at you, this may not be fair, the unanswered question, the unanswerable question, to hear what you'll say. You say, and this does go back to what you were talking about a little earlier, his gift required unrequited love. This is you. Hence the moving on. He was not, and again, there are ellipses in this.
It's okay. Yeah.
He was not artistically derailed by bad times, but by good times. He never let them last. In terms of the ballets, we understand what you mean, I think, with going on from one love to another. Consider Suzanne Farrell as Dulcinea or Allegra Kent as the young icon-like woman on high who never touches the ground in the unanswered question. Who is she? Is this love? Is it religion? Is it possible for him to tell them apart?
You mean who is the woman?
Who is the woman?
Who is the woman? I mean, that's in a way, the key question.
The unanswerable
The
question.
unanswerable question. I mean, I think it's so many things, right? It's everything from the Virgin to, it's a religious...
As the unanswered question, she looks like a virgin carried in a holy procession.
Certainly
yeah.
Suzanne in Quixote, for sure.
Oh,
yeah,
she was dressed that way, yes.
Yeah, she was dressed that way.
Yeah.
It was very clearly that kind of an image. I think there's just, I think he appreciated both eroticism and love, and it was the core of everything for him. And, I mean, isn't it the core of everything? He really believed that, and the other thing that I found extraordinary, and maybe this is an illumination of that, is there's an extraordinary correspondence between him and Vera Zorina, who was his, I'll get it right, third wife.
Oh.
And she kept his letters. So we have his words, his letters. These are passionate love letters to her, tormented love letters. And he wants her so much, and many of the women said, he smothered us. He wanted everything, the creative, the physical, but the ideal, not the woman who's, as he said with Maria Tolchief, who lays down paper in the bathroom to make sure you won't step on the floor she just mopped, and says, don't go there. And he's like, no, I want her to be a sort of image who flies into the theater. And so he had a kind of very complicated and difficult view of women, actually, because he was never able to settle the problem of living with a woman in the world. He could only live with a woman on the stage, and not him on the stage, her on the stage. And the minute that started to falter, the marriages started to falter. And so there's a way in which one of his greatest aspirations, I think, was to transcend the everyday. He really, he didn't care about money. He cared about sensuality and about food and about smells and about touch. But these things were all part of the woman, or of the whole world they were making. And I think they were really building an entire world inside this theater that they were all involved in, and everybody had a part, and he was at its center. But he gave them a lot of freedom. It's not that he was like some autocrat controlling everybody, and you know, he just handed it out to them and trusted them. Getting a little lost here, but I think it's because the women are as we, you know, going back to the very beginning in your first question and observation, they are sort of the atmosphere in which he was able to transcend the everyday. And that's, you know, he would say, what we're doing here is something a little bit different. And he would talk about, you know, the fourth dimension. It's not unheard of for artists at that time to speak this way, but he certainly really believed it. And they really believed it. And, you know, sort of winding your observations and some of the themes we've talked about back together, you know, the dancers, many of them speak of it as a religion, that for them it was, as they put it, like a religion. I heard this over and over again. Yeah. Sex without sex, like a religion. It was a kind of, you know, the eroticism was, I mean, these are young, beautiful people all in a room wearing very few clothes. It was sort of just evident. And they were all very sensual people, or not all maybe, but many. Right. But the sort of extra-human element, the ways in which he was making not just dancers, but other creatures. And they were becoming other creatures. And they would say of him, you know, he's not human. And he would say of himself, I'm not a male. I'm air, I'm water. And he meant this. You know, I'm a cloud in trousers. That's you know, I'm a man. I can't help it, I'm a man. That's just, that's what I am. But really, I'm a cloud. And the cloud was the...
Well, it's a Mayakovsky quote.
It's a quote from Mayakovsky. Yeah. And so it's a quote that comes from a very violent poem, actually. So it has roots in this whole revolutionary moment, but it's one that speaks to the idea of the flesh and the transcendence of the flesh through the flesh.
They're signaling us that we have seconds to go.
Okay.
Alas. I would like to end with a quote from Jennifer, which I think expresses a lot of what she's been saying. And there are a couple of little ellipses here, but not much. What a Balanchine ballet was. There are so many things I didn't get to ask you. Oh, God. Okay. It was alive and unpredictable, bound to music, but also free within it. He made ballets for dancers to live in, and when everything worked, they ran free. Free especially from him. Whatever stains his faults left on their lives, whatever his efforts to carve their bodies, on stage, no one could touch them. And that was part of his point. The power of their liberation and of him watching them free themselves from him with the tools he had given them was part of the drama of his dances. Balanchine's ballets brought them all together in a synchronous musical world, a community governed by the strictures and freedoms of his art. How could real life ever compete? And I think audience questions, yes, all right. Oh, I have.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudia. I know. Well, you know. Hopefully.
Can I keep asking questions while I look at this? These are long. Oh, this is what I was going to ask. Ha! Double duty. Did your career as a dancer make a difference in writing this book? If so, in what way?
I mean, I think so, for sure, because I think there's a way in which you know, doing these dances, you understand their power in a way that is similar but different to when you see them. And
I mean, I envy you that. I think you must have it not coming into your eyes, but coming out from your body.
I just, you know, I think that dances can be a kind of intellectual history. So you can see ideas in a movement. And that's sort of how I try to approach it, which is probably, just like my deformation professionnelle. That's who I am as a person. I'm sort of always was like that. And so, I was always the one with the book in the classroom, and then I was always the one in the university with the, the running shoes on, and I was always so I was always kind of like trying to go both ways. And I think knowing what it feels like just gave me a sense of what the dancers were telling me when they were telling me. It also, to be honest, meant that, this is a very interesting world in a sort of, it's a very closed world in many ways, even though it's a profession that's open to the public. The world itself is quite, we were a family and we don't wash our laundry in public. And it's like one of them said to me, it's like this. Yeah. Either you're in the circle or you're out the circle, but you're nowhere.
So you think they told you things that might not have told someone who wasn't a dancer?
I do think so.
Oh, that's important.
Yeah,
right?
I think that I had been in the circle. I've been on both sides. But I knew what they were talking about.
Right. They might have trusted you more. I've got more questions. What surprised you the most in your interviews about Mr. B's life and character?
Oh, that's a tough one. What surprised me the most? I suppose, because I too grew up with what I now think of, excuse me, as the sort of modernist myth that he also perpetuated, which is, we don't need program notes, we don't need anything. He walks into the studio with nothing in his head. There's what you were talking about earlier, the consciousness of this. And so the depth of his reading, this was a man who kept saying, I'm not an intellectual, I don't know, well, not really. He may not have been an academic, right. But he was certainly somebody who had immense curiosity about especially philosophy and religion. And so his reading was vast, and fiction, and the Bible, of course. The Bible was a go-to text. But there were these texts that became seminal. Quixote, crucial. The Bible, Midsummer Night's Dream, Goethe, Mayakovsky, Gogol, Tolstoy. There are others.
Here's a question: What are the most salient critiques of Balanchine's style, but then of choreography? Do you think these critiques are valid? I'm not sure what that. I thought it was style of dancing, and I'm not sure what we mean by style of choreography.
The salient critique about his style of choreography is that it's incredibly broad. People think of him as a classical choreographer, especially now, because many of the dances have become much more classical than they were, in the sense of more conservative. He was and saw himself, and this is one of the great things about him, I think, is that he was somebody who inherited the imperial system because he was young, he was brought up in it. But he also took away, even if he hated the violence of the revolution, he was part of the revolutionary moment, and he was part of the revolutionary artistic moment, and he wanted to be, as he said over and over, progressive. And he saw himself as very much on the edge, on the avant-garde. He was not just, sort of, and so his sort of making of classical ballet into a completely different thing than it was when he left is I think, the most important. And his work is incredibly broad. It went from very beautiful patterned things to incredibly ugly dances with disturbing elements and some of those are lost and gone, but they exist. They were part of it.
I think Jennifer is touching on something we didn't get to here that much, but it is why her book is titled His 20th Century. There is a lot to do with revolution and with what I think you call sort of walking out of dying worlds just in time, or that's a paraphrase, but the revolution and then Paris in 1933 and what he carries with him from those experiences throughout his life.
Yeah, exactly. And he was always trying, here's in 1933, he starts a company, they ballet 1933, and he mounts the first production of Seven Deadly Sins with Brecht and Weil. And, it's a project that comes, but this is a really, this is the moment. He says, we're not trying to say anything, we're just trying to say what 1933 is. That's the program note. That's what it is. So he's not trying to be Petipa, right? He's taking from Petipa, to be sure, but he's not trying to be Petipa. And it's not, even somebody once said to him, you're not a modern dancer. And he said, well, what do you mean by a modern dancer? You mean somebody who doesn't wear shoes? And then he said, well, I think it's all the same thing. It's all dance. It's all dance. Now, ballet had a special place because it had an organizing system of the body that could ground what then fell apart.
Yeah, you have to say what was more modern than, let's say, Central Park in the Dark and Ives Ziana, or in episodes where he does the difficult abstract choreography and Martha Graham is brought in and does a pageant about Mary Queen of Scots. So who's the modern choreographer at that point?
I think that was his point.
I have another question here if we still have a minute. Can one really say that a specific decade in his career, in his work, was greater than any other? Or period, I guess. It doesn't have to be a decade.
I don't know, not to me,
Yeah.
because partly because we don't really know a lot about what the dances in the 20s and 30s looked like. We know some of them, but not all of them. And I mean, the 50s were amazing, 60s are incredible, 70s are wow. I mean, it's really hard to. It's different, and it grows, and it progresses, and it goes forward and back, and it's like any body of art. Right? Or not any, but many
like
bodies of art. It's like
well,
Picasso
a
or
couple.
something, where
Right.
you've got different periods and you've got different things and preoccupations, different women.
Here's a question of somebody of my era. Balanchine was upset by the dancers' strike. Ooh, I remember that. What did you learn about it?
The dancers' strike?
Yeah. Was that, or did that not take up much of your time?
That's in the book for sure, because I mean, I think as he got older, he didn't understand the idea that there would be things that dancers needed or deserved that they weren't getting. He would say, we worked all night. We didn't get paid.
We ate rats.
We ate rats. We did this, we did that. What do you want? Do you want to become the bourgeoisie? You don't want to become. That's what we're against. We don't want to be that.
Try that at Lincoln Center, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he was afraid of that. He was constantly running from that. And as he became a kind of establishment figure, that created a crisis for him. That was a crisis because he was used to being on the other side. And the whole idea of, I mean, it's a Cold War life in the sense that he's doing everything against Russia, but he's also doing everything against capitalism and materialism. Anything that's overly materialistic. For him, it was the life and the spirit. It's a metaphysical pursuit. And he's not sympathetic. His response to the union or the idea that the dancers would go on strike is, you don't want to dance? I'll take the people that do want to dance and we'll start a new company. This is the third, fourth, fifth, sixth company. I'll start a new one. I want to vote right now.
Was he
All
really
of it.
ready to do that?
He did it before. I mean, sure, he's playing high. It's a hijinks thing, right?
Right.
And I think he knew that they would stay with him.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a lot to be lost there. But I think he was angry. He was rarely really angry, and that was a moment when he was really angry. He didn't like the union rules. What do you mean we have to stop?
Right.
I've given my life to this. What you want to go eat a croissant? What? You know, you like the French, you have to
like
eat
the
lunch.
French. Yeah, that's what he said about the
Le
French.
restaurant,
right?
he said.
Yeah.
The restaurant runs the Paris Opera. You know, I don't want to work there because they're all about le restaurant. You know, they don't want to work. Americans want to work. He was very
Wait, he said that
into
to Kirstein right at the start, right?
He did
Why
say
he
that
wanted
to
to get out of
Kirstein.
Paris.
Yeah.
Right? All they wanted to do was eat. Yeah.
Take a break. Take a break.
Take a break and go have lunch. Yeah.
Of course, he also really wanted to run the Paris Opera. So, you know, it's not entirely simple matter.
Uh-huh. Yeah. We have well, the last one is just your process itself. How do you organize your research and interviews? I like this, to get the quotes and scenes you need.
Actually, I suppose the answer to that is I don't.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I really am a bit of a, I mean, it's incredibly labor intensive to do history. And it's.
How long did you work on this book?
I worked on this book for 10 years, and like solid 10 years. So, and I have, you know, yeah, sure, I have a method, right? I did long interviews. I taped some of them. I took notes in others, depending on what the situation was, what was going to make people feel more relaxed. And I transcribed them all by myself, every single one of them, because like, you know, just like transcribing the scores, right? I found that if I was in the notes and in their words, in their language, over and over again, it just would take hours. And the ditto with I took, what's my process? I mean, I do all the research and then I organize all the notes. And there's like thousands of pages. It took me a year to organize my notes into piles. And I thought, oh my God, if I take a year, I might never write this book. But I thought, if I don't take a year, how will I write this book?
Right.
You know? So I did. And I don't look for the quotes for sure. That I don't do, because the whole fun of the thing and the whole interest of it that took me, I mean, it was the greatest privilege of my professional life to write this book, because Balanchine is vast. And he was much vaster than even I imagined, you know, and the roads you can go down, I mean, at a certain point I had to stop, but the dancers and the interviews take you there, the sources take you there, and you have to go down that rabbit hole, and you have to, I found, and it was also just, I love that, you know. Read Spinoza for 3 months? Great, you know. Talk to a dancer again to try to just like see, what was that thing she said? Why did she say that, you know?
I think we get that
So
pleasure in the work out of the book.
I
Jennifer.
really love the subject, and I admired the work so deeply that I was hell-bent to try to understand it in a way that I could then communicate to other people.
Well,
So
it shows. So
thank you.
congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you all for being here. This is just...
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Done. Okay.
Oh, I could talk with you for hours.
I know. Can we go to dinner?
I think we need to go have coffee. You know?
I know. We could do this again, and I could ask you all different questions.
Yeah, I would love it. I would love it. They were such great questions. I mean, like straight to the heart of things.